Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's TA chat. Happy December, happy almost winter break, just a few more days, and many of us will be able to clock out at least for a couple of days, hopefully. Glad to have you here today. I'm glad you could make it. My name is Teresa Nemirsky. I'm one of the technical assistant specialists with Florida's PBIS project. What we're going to be talking about today is relationship-based discipline, and we'll have a couple of activities throughout the presentation, and we'll also be able to kind of summarize the different strategies that we're sharing at the end of the presentation. If you have if you need the link to today's handouts, I just put that into the chat box. Please feel free, you can chat at me. I've got my window open here on my computer screen. You have microphone rights, so you can unmute yourself and you can talk to me just to make things go a little bit quicker. So again, I'm glad you could make it here today, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, so our objectives is first we're going to talk about those characteristics of relationship-based discipline, and then we're going to identify a range of relationship-based discipline strategies. So let's get started. I'd like to hear from you all. You can type into chat, or if you want to use your microphone, please feel free again to do that. How would you personally define relationship-based discipline? Where are we starting from? How would you define relationship-based discipline? So I'm looking to hear from you. How would you define relationship-based discipline? Julie, thank you for that. Let me see here. Is anyone else having, well, that's the wrong question to ask. Can anyone else hear me? That would be my question. Julie, I appreciate that feedback. On my side, my microphone settings look like they're being responsive. All right, Erin, thank you very much. Julie, if you need to jump out of the meeting and jump back in, sometimes that will help reset the settings on your computer. All right, Jason, thank you. Thank you. All right, guys, I appreciate that. All right, so thank goodness for subtitles. So we'll go ahead and summarize what we have in the meeting chat so far. So Laura says relationship-based discipline to her is looking at the rules through the lens of how following or not following the rules affects relationships with peers and community. I like that take on it. So we're already kind of centering interpersonal relationships, community relationships within the discipline process. So Erin says reteaching skills based on connections you have with the students. Erin, I think that you've been looking at the PowerPoint slides. No, I'm kidding. I know you haven't, but I really like that summary. Relationship-based discipline being a process of reteaching skills and using our relationships with students, building on our relationships with students to help increase some of those different skills that we'd like them to display. Dama, I see your comment there. Discipline practices that are built on a foundation that establishes relationships and prioritize restoring and repairing them when damage is done. Thank you, Dama. Yes, I think that is a terrific summary. For me, some of the key ideas that stand out with this is kind of focusing on the relationship piece, again, building on those relationships, making sure that we're centering relationships in our disciplinary process. So that means prioritizing relationship building activities, drawing from those relationships to establish connections with students, and providing new skills and helping students kind of take responsibility for actions and figuring out how to restore the situation that they have found themselves in. Okay, so the reason why we're talking about relationship-based discipline is because we now have a large body of research that shows again and again and again those negative outcomes of exclusionary discipline. And now when I talk about exclusionary discipline, I kind of frame it up as any disciplinary action that removes the student from their classroom community. So I've had people ask me, does that include timeout in another classroom? Well, in my definition, that would include that, right? For me, if you're in a classroom situation, you have students acting in different ways. The way that we respond to those ways, we are either bringing students into the community or we are pushing them out of the community. So I do have a very broad perspective when it comes to defining what exclusionary discipline means. However, most of the research has been done on much more concrete forms of exclusionary discipline, like out-of-school suspension. We know there's lots and lots of research showing the negative outcomes of things like suspension. So that could be things along the lines of having a negative impact on school climate. That could be having a negative impact on how staff perceive their administrators, which might be surprising, right? Because a lot of administrators will say they suspend students so that they can show their teachers they have their backs. However, if you're a part of a high suspending school, many times the teachers have a negative impact of administration, feeling like they're not really fixing any problems. So that's kind of an interesting paradox there. We also know that suspension leads to negative academic and social outcomes, and that can persist we have research showing from middle school all the way up to high school and post-secondary outcomes, including overall life outcomes. So there's kind of a cascading effect, negative effect of suspension. We know too that it's unlikely to work for the students who are most often or most likely to receive it, right? We have research showing that students who receive out-of-school suspension during the first 3 months of the school year are much more likely to receive another out-of-school suspension by the end of the year. So that's almost like an early warning indicator. If a student receives a suspension by beginning of November, chances are pretty good they're going to get another one before the year is out. So that's an opportunity for us to proactively identify those students and intervene. And then the final bit there is that suspension increases the risk for poor mental health outcomes. I'm going to talk about that in a second. If you have questions about the research base regarding out-of-school suspension, we have a couple of resources that are in the binder now. And you can access those at your leisure. And Julie, I just saw your comment there in the chat, so thank you for letting me know you can hear. Okay, now in terms of mental health outcomes, what we know about exclusionary discipline is that it can have a negative impact on students who have experienced trauma. So it can even, especially if you implement discipline inconsistently across your school, you can risk re-traumatizing students. So there are certain types of responses like isolation, restraint, minimizing situations, ignoring situations, being inconsistent, and being inflexible. All of those can be common triggers for re-traumatizing our students. And we know that there's a higher degree of trauma amongst our students than we might initially anticipate. So your discipline process overall should incorporate trauma-informed practices. The good news is if you're doing PBIS, Tier 1 PBIS with Fidelity, then there is a very high likelihood you're already incorporating many aspects of trauma-informed practices into your discipline system. So there is more information about that on our website, and there's a link there to the live binders so you can access that information directly. All right, we also know one of the problems with exclusionary discipline is that it is used more frequently with students from some groups versus students from other groups. Now, I don't want to get too heavily into the research. This is based on 2015-16 data, and it's a 2018 report, which is the most current data we have at this time. But in this particular display of colors and columns, the red column that you see for each of those student groups, that represents the students' enrollment within the population. Those different colored columns after that red column shows the different types of discipline that students from these groups receive. Now, there really is no reason that a student should have more discipline than their representation within the general population, right? So if we have about 18% of students in US schools who are Black, then we would expect to see about 18% of students who receive these different disciplinary consequences to also be Black, right? So we would look to make all of those discipline consequences even with student enrollment. Now, if I can help you visualize that a little bit more, that's not exactly what you see. I've covered up all of the columns that are equal to or lower than student enrollment. So which groups do you notice here are more likely to be represented in discipline? What do you guys see in the graph? Dana, thank you. You were right on it. Students who are Black and students with disabilities are much more highly represented in different types of discipline than you would expect given the percentage of the student population. Oh, yay. Thank you, Dana. I appreciate that feedback. So yeah, that's what we see. We also see for students who are white, there are certain types of overrepresentation for students who are white. For example, students who are, I believe that is harassed or bullied based on disability. And then this teal column, seclusion. So students who are white are a little overrepresented in seclusion. In my guess, initially, again, not looking at the data in detail, but my guess is that there's some overlap here between students who are white and students with disabilities. And that's because students with disabilities are, they have such a higher representation in discipline than other groups of students. So if you're curious about this particular issue, we do have an infographic that summarizes some of that research, some of those findings, so you can use that to build awareness amongst your staff. And the other thing that I would like to point out, and this is really specific to students with disabilities, we talk about overrepresentation in things like suspension, in-school suspension, expulsion, but having overrepresentation in non-suspension disciplinary offenses can also pose a really big problem for schools and districts. Just over the summer, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, OSERS, they published a Dear Colleague letter, which is a little resource that they publish from time to time just to give states and districts more information, hopefully more clarity about certain aspects of federal law. What they clarified in this summer's Dear Colleague letter is that there are certain suspension, quote unquote, alternatives that are potentially subject to IDEA protections. So things like having an informal removal where you have a student who has an IEP and they're just kind of sent home early for the day. It's not an official suspension, but we thought it was best for the student, quote unquote, to have them go home with their families. So informal removals, in-school suspensions, bus suspensions in some circumstances, all of these things can count towards students with disabilities, their access to their free and appropriate public education. So I cannot interpret the law for you, but I can share that if you're looking at discipline patterns, discipline that includes some of these alternatives may be important for your school in terms of ensuring your students who have disabilities are receiving a free and appropriate public education. By the way, y'all, if you have questions as we go, please feel free to jump in. Now, I've talked about the harmful effects of discipline. So now what do we do to reduce it, right? So how do we reduce suspension? I'm actually going to go into that in more detail now. But before we get started, here's a little game for you all. You can access it if you go to the link for today's handouts. And if you go into that link and you scroll down a little bit, the key to reducing suspension, this is a little word game that we can play. So when you get there, go ahead and press start. And it's going to ask you just to start guessing some numbers until you can figure out what the answer is for this particular issue. So what is the key to reducing exclusionary discipline? And I apologize, you all cannot see what I just did. So let me do that again. All right. There we go. So again, so I navigated to today's handout presentation. And I scroll down here to keys to reducing suspension. And I just hit start. Sorry about that. All right, so go ahead and start guessing some letters until you can fill in the blanks. Nope, that wasn't the right one. Let's go with an E. That's always a common one, right? Nope. All right, so let's see who can guess the answer to this particular puzzle. Awesome, Dana, you get the prize. It is prevention. That's right. The key to reducing suspension is really making sure that you're using as many preventative strategies as makes sense for your school. Excuse me. So the reason being is that there's a limit to the number of responses we have to situationally inappropriate behavior. But there really is no limit to the number of prevention strategies that we can use. So I'm going to go into those in just a little bit of detail. And what my goal is here is to link you all to some resources so that if you would like more information on these things, you can access them. Okay, and bear with me. There we go. Welcome, Robin. Glad you can make it. All right, so those preventative approaches, and all of these approaches were mentioned in that Dear Colleague letter that OSERS published this past summer. So that's where these are coming from. But the preventative approaches for suspension include universal design for learning. Remember, good instruction prevents like 80% of your behavior problems. So universal design for learning is important, as is PBIS, which includes universal screening and multi-tiered systems of support, and also relationship-based and relevant strategies. So universal design for learning, if you're unfamiliar with that term, what that is it is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning based on scientific insights into how humans learn. And what you really need to do UDL well, first of all, is a strength-based approach to interpreting learning for students, right? So interpreting how do we best teach our students, we have to go into that thinking about what our students' strengths and preferences are. Universal design for learning is deliberately designed. It is instruction where we have different ways of presenting information, different ways of asking students to engage with the material, different types of curricula we may use to make sure that we're engaging all students in the material, and also different ways of having students demonstrate what they've learned. Now, you can get a lot of information about UDL from our partner project, Florida's PSRTI project. There's a link there on the slide for you. Something I would like to add to the conversation about UDL is including student voice in that intentional instructional design. Basically, students really are experts in the things that they like, right? And if we're going to make sure that our environment and our instruction is engaging for students, we should utilize their preferences as much as we can. So what that means is asking students, hey, what do you like? What would you prefer to do? So you can ask for their preferences about the best ways of presenting information, and there are different varieties of ways of doing that. You can ask for their preferences and how to respond to the information. Like maybe you have some students in your class who really like being called on just randomly. That's probably not the case, but if you did, and you knew that going into your lessons, then you can use that strategy more often. Also, and this is directly related to PBIS, is getting students' preferences for the types of acknowledgement they receive. I think most educators are aware that as students get older, they may not really like having that positive attention in front of all of their peers. So just understanding, do they like public versus private recognition? Do they like verbal recognition? Do they like tokens? Do they like points? What is it that they like? How would they like to be recognized and given feedback that what they're doing is in line with school-wide expectations? Another piece is the rewards. So again, the types of rewards that you're offering to your students. I hear many times, how do we get students to buy into our Tier 1 reward system? And my answer is always, ask students what they want and how they would like to receive it, right? Your students will tell you how to make your reward strategies successful. Something else that ties into this idea of UDL is differentiating your supports so that all students have access, all students can participate in these different types of instruction, right? So what that might mean related to behavior is that there may be some of these micro social skills that not all students are fluent with. So for example, if you wanted to design a lesson where peers were collaborating with one another about a particular topic, you can see all of the different types of social skills that go into making peer collaboration a successful way of instructing students. So what you can do in terms of how this applies to discipline is, first of all, in lesson planning, thinking about what social skills do kids need in order to participate in this instruction and benefit from it equitably. So you can think about that in designing your instruction. You can also think about that from the administrative side. If you have a student with you in the office and maybe they were disrupting a lesson, well, did they have all of those little micro skills that were necessary to engage effectively? And so if that's not the case, then your disciplinary response for that particular situation could be to help the student build fluency with some of these micro skills. Now, one of the resources that I like personally in terms of teaching these specific micro skills, I call them, is the skill streaming curriculum. And they make a version for elementary school students. They make a version for secondary students. I think they might even have like an early childhood version of skill streaming. The reason I like it is they take specific micro social skills like this and they break them down in concrete steps. So it makes it very easy for me to engage with a student, talk with them, and kind of formulate what does this particular skill look like. So that's one of the resources that I like. This particular resource here, where we're looking at different types of instructional strategies and the social skills that are required to do them well, that is available in our live binders on our website. So the link is there on the slide for you. PBIS, that should be a no-brainer, especially for the folks that we're talking with today, right? However, the thing that might be new for some of your administrators or some of your teachers is that consistent with IDEA, if the behavior of a child with a disability impedes their learning or the learning of others, the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports and other strategies must be considered to address that behavior. And that comes out of that Dear Colleague letter that was published this past summer. So PBIS is not just a good thing to do. It's not just something that has lots and lots of research to back up how effective it is, but it's also something that is basically required by law. It is urgently recommended. If you're not doing PBIS and you ever get called out on it, people will ask you why not. And hopefully you have a very good reason for not using it. Now, there's a lot that can go into PBIS, right? At tier 1, we have those 10 critical elements. We have advanced tiers of PBIS. But if you need to beef up either on your own PBIS knowledge base and skills and being able to target different actions, we have a couple of trainings available on our website. This first one here, if you are a team member who's never been on a PBIS team before, we see that a lot here in Florida. There is a new team member training that you can access on our website. The link is right there on the PowerPoint slide for you. If you are someone who has actually been trained in PBIS, maybe it's been a little while, maybe you'd like to hear some different takes on how we're implementing PBIS in 2022, then we have some skill development modules for you. Specifically, there's one there about Tier 1 Revisited, where we talk about some of the updates we have to Tier 1 practices, like how do we make sure that we're engaging or designing a system that's engaging for all of our students, right? How do we integrate mental health supports? How do we integrate trauma-informed practices and that sort of thing? So those are resources available for you should you need them. All right, now universal screening, that was another strategy, a prevention strategy to reduce your need for suspension. The idea being is that if we are actively going out and trying to proactively identify students who have more intensive needs, then we can get to them and support them effectively before they ever wind up in a situation where suspension might be a consideration, right? So that is the goal here. I'm curious for the folks who are with us this afternoon, who's using a universal screening at their schools? Is anyone? Okay, I'm not seeing much activity in the chat. This is actually one of the points that traditionally has been kind of challenging for our schools. I just saw Dama's comment come in. Marion County uses universal screening at all elementary schools, and they are piloting it in 2 middle schools this year. So kudos to Marion County. If you are watching this recording after the fact, I am proud of your work in this effort, because this is really, in my view, one of those missing pieces as to why we still continue to have higher rates of discipline, because it really is key to find students early and support them early. So good job for that. If you go to our website, the Tier 2 page, we have some different Tier 2 resources. One of them is an informal screening tool that's based on the SSBD, and how you translate those acronyms. It's escaping me at the moment, but the Systematic Screener for Behavior Disorders, there it is. So it's based on that particular instrument. It's not tested, it's not as stringent as the actual tool, but it might be something that's helpful in the short term to help your school identify kids who need more support. Once you know who those students are and have an idea of what their needs are, then you can start to implement Tier 2 interventions that directly address those needs, right? So you can, again, get in there early before they build up a history of situationally inappropriate behaviors. So there's a number of different social Tier 2 interventions that are available for folks. The ones that are listed here on the slide, most of these are just general strategies, like social skills instruction. There are many curricula that you can use for that. Developing supports to help students develop those social relationships. Self-management strategies are huge. Check and Connect, that is actually an exception. That's an actual program that is basically like mentoring. You can use it at the secondary levels. So Check and Connect is another Tier 2 sort of intervention. And then again, relationship-based practices, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail as we go on. So there are a variety of Tier 2 strategies you can put into place. And the key there again is making sure that those strategies are aligned to your students' needs. That also brings us into this idea about providing Tier 3 in multiple levels. This is something our website was just recently updated, so you can check out the Tier 3 page on our website. And we talk about having multiple levels of support within that top level of the triangle. So you can provide very brief FBA sorts of meetings and supports designed around a student that are efficient and easy for staff to complete. That really is key, because if they're efficient and easy, then you can offer them to more students who have that need. If that's not sufficient, then you can kind of amp up the amount of time and attention and detail, and you can provide a more comprehensive support at Tier 3 with more comprehensive FBAs, which are functional behavior assessments, and BIPs, your behavior improvement plans. In situations where even those comprehensive FBAs and BIPs are not sufficient, that's when you can stop and look at wraparound supports for a student, where you bring in more of your community partners, where they can help to provide necessary services that maybe the school can't offer, or that the school can't offer in the amount that the student needs them. Mental health services comes right to mind when I think about situations like that. Social services might be another area for wraparound supports. So by building the systematic design of Tier 3 supports in varying levels of intensity, then we can make it a little bit easier to address more students' needs. And again, the key here is to do it early on, because that's before those needs get more intensive, and it's easier to change student behavior. Now, kind of related to that idea, and is something that maybe in recent years with our trainings, we haven't emphasized as much, but building the capacity of all your staff to understand some basic functions of behavior. We still see a number of FBAs that are based on non-evidence-based functions of behavior. So things like the function of the student's behavior is to get control, or occasionally we'll see something along the lines of the function of the student's behavior is to press my buttons. We don't see that one as much, so we've definitely made some gains there. But needless to say, there are 6 basic functions of behavior that are grounded in research, and that's to get or get away from attention, things, or sensations. So if we can help our teachers start to think about behavior in a way that is related to student behavior function, then what we can do then is help the teachers respond more effectively at the classroom level, right? So if we have a student who tends to call out and is disruptive in order to get attention, then we can help the teacher identify some more desirable ways for the student to get attention so that they don't have to disrupt instruction. So if we can build the capacity of teachers to identify those antecedents, identify those consequences, and think about which one of these 6 basic functions is a student probably trying to achieve, then we can help teachers intervene more successfully. Now, we have a resource, again, on our website. The link is printed there at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. You can click on that. It's going to take you to a number of different ideas for student-level interventions that are aligned to the functions of behavior. So that's available for you. And if you're one of our Florida schools, this is something you can reach out to your district coordinator, and your district coordinators can reach out to your technical assistance providers, and we can develop a lot more support around this particular topic. Okay, the final big preventative strategy was to make sure that regardless of what we're providing, whether it's in terms of instruction, whether it's in terms of your Tier 1 PBIS system, that we're using practices that are relevant and meaningful for students. Some ways of ensuring that that happens is to take some time first, again, prioritize getting to know our students, building relationships with all of our students, and then by doing that, we can recognize and affirm students' different backgrounds, right? Because we don't want to make assumptions about where kids come from, what they do or do not value, same thing for their families. So we have to build those relationships, and then based on what we know about our student populations, make sure that our students and our families, all of them, are included in what we're doing at the universal level. So empathy is another approach. This is something that you can coach your teachers to do more of. It's actually an evidence-based way of reducing exclusionary discipline. What that does is basically just having people stop and think about like basically just how is the student feeling right now? Because what that can do is it can help you with verbal de-escalation strategies. It can also help with that relationship building with the student. And it can also basically make you want to avoid sending the student out of your classroom community or out of your school community. So if we lead with empathy, trying to understand what the student is feeling, why they are feeling that way, then that tends to lead to much more creative and meaningful ways of addressing situationally inappropriate behaviors. So there we go. The final point here is to really work on empowering our students and families to lead efforts to address disparities in school-wide discipline. Again, this goes back to the fact that we all need to bring a little humility with us into our professional setting. We don't know students and families as well as students and families know themselves. And so if we can give them the skills and the opportunity, especially the opportunities, so that they understand, they are aware of what the disparities look like. They can give some insight as to their experiences around those disparities. How have those disparities impacted them personally? What are their ideas for addressing the disparities? Family and student voice in that regard can be exceptionally powerful, not just for identifying new ways of intervening with students, but also to help strengthen those relationships. So if you need more information on that, definitely contact your FLPBIS TA provider, and we can have that conversation with you. Okay, so now we're going to get into some specific responses that you can use if you have a student in front of you for their behavioral errors. So this was kind of neat. We had a couple of studies, or there were a couple of studies that were done that basically interviewed a bunch of principals and asked them, why do you choose to suspend a student? And of all the things that those different principals shared with these different researchers, all of those rationales fell into these 5 categories that you see on the slide. So for each one of those rationales for suspending a student, we know that there are more effective alternatives that will accomplish the same thing. So for example, one rationale for maybe suspending a student is to get the parents' attention. A much more effective way of getting parent attention would be to design like a multi-tiered system of authentic, positive, and ongoing family engagement. Many times family engagement is kind of a one-directional flow of information from the school to families, and doing what we can to look at opportunities where we can get a two-way flow of information going, where we can establish a history of positive interactions about the students. That can go a long way to getting parents' attention. And it will help us if we do need to pick up the phone and call a parent about a student's disciplinary offense. They're going to pay attention because they know you. So part of that too is building in system level support for family engagement. So prioritizing interactions with families, prioritizing opportunities for obtaining and using student voice. Those would be systems level supports. So for example, starting to have meetings, starting to hold focus groups, advertising for these focus groups, designing incentives around participating in focus groups, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many ways that we can support getting that voice included. Parent shadowing is another one. And that's basically, this is a disciplinary consequence some of our schools have used where a student has a disciplinary offense, and then the consequence for that is the family member has to come in and they basically shadow their child all throughout the school day. So this can have a multitude of reasons why that might be effective, ranging from embarrassment for some students, right? They want to avoid that kind of attention in school, to maybe even just getting parents' attention because they can see what that school environment is like and how their child is responding. So that's one particular strategy you can include. Many administrators say that they use suspension in order to deter other students. And there are way more effective alternatives for that, including differential reinforcement and pre-correction. I'm going to explain those in a second. Different ways of improving the learning environment. I'm going to explain those in a second. Providing temporary relief to teachers, and removing the offending student for safety reasons. That last rationale is really the most justified rationale for suspending a student, but there are ways of doing that in a way that will be more effective for the student long-term. And that really focuses around, yes, we have to exclude the student for safety reasons, but during that period, we're teaching alternative behaviors. And when they come back into the school setting, we're working to restore whatever relationship was harmed in the course of that disciplinary offense, right? So reintegrating the student successfully and positively into the school or classroom environment. Now, this slide lists some specific ways of getting direct family involvement. If you're familiar with the check-in, check-out, or behavior education program, Tier 2 intervention, one of the components of that intervention is the student takes their point card home and has their family member just review it and leave a comment on how they did, either for the day or for that week. We talked about shadowing and observation. We also have some schools where family members will attend a Saturday school or an after hours kind of a school, but it takes place in the evening after most folks are done with work. But they attend some sort of instructional session or sessions with their child. So those are more effective ways of getting direct family involvement. Deterrence for other students. Behavior-specific praise and differentiated reinforcement are hugely, hugely effective. And that can take place proactively, so before we see any sorts of situationally inappropriate behaviors. And it can also occur if we notice that a student is starting to demonstrate some of those situationally inappropriate behaviors. Basically, that behavior-specific praise, you're identifying the student, you're describing the behavior, and you're linking it back to a school-wide expectation. That's how you do behavior-specific praise. It's exceptionally important. Those general praise statements like, hey, good job, really appreciate you guys. It's nice, but it's not an evidence-based way of increasing the student behaviors that we want to see. So being specific in our praise and tying it back to our expectations. Differential reinforcement means we're providing acknowledgement to some students, those who are demonstrating the behaviors we want to see, versus giving attention, which could be a form of reinforcement for students engaging in situationally inappropriate behaviors. for many of you, I'm guessing that that is not new information. But the thing that you might want to attend to, and this would be something to work out maybe as part of your classroom walkthroughs, or maybe having conversations with your teachers where you're coaching them to reflect on their classroom management practices, is to think about any disparities that there might be in terms of students' receipt of praise. We are seeing some emerging evidence that shows that in schools that have disproportionate discipline, so overrepresentation of certain student groups in school-wide outcomes, we also see in those schools an underrepresentation of those same students in terms of access to school-wide rewards. So that is something that's a relatively new idea that you could start to have conversations about, working into your classroom management PLCs, thinking about how how teachers can monitor their use of praise and how they're delivering it across students in their classroom. All right, so now let me pause and ask folks, what do you think for the schools either that you serve, if you're kind of that state level or district level person, or if you're a school-based person, what are some of the offenses that your students tend to get suspended for in your schools? What do you all think? Why do you think students in your schools are getting suspended? Aaron, thank you. Safety issues such as fighting. Fighting, racial slurs, assault, drugs, alcohol, weapons. Some of those are really big offenses. Okay, so we'll go with those answers. Oh, excellent, Patrick, thank you. Physical acts towards teachers and peers. It's interesting, when we ask this question of staff members in different schools, we hear those responses a lot. However, and this is kind of another paradox, it's a little surprising. What research finds is that the majority of suspensions that are taking place in our schools are for discretionary offenses, things that suspension is not mandatory for. And most of those discretionary offenses are nonviolent. And in addition, they're pretty subjective, meaning that my interpretation of disrespect, like that would be the infraction, that could be very, very different from the students that were involved, or students who were observing, or family members, et cetera, et cetera. So the vast majority of suspensions are written for discretionary, nonviolent, subjective infractions. So what the Office of Special Education has to say about that is that exclusionary discipline should not be used for nonviolent offenses, things like tardiness, absenteeism, or subjective offenses such as defiance or disrespect. So this is definitely something where it's worth taking another look at your school-wide data. When we've talked with school staff whose schools have disproportionate discipline outcomes, we've asked them the question, why do you think, or what types of offenses do you think are taking place? Frequently, we get the same answers that you all shared in today's chat. They look at physical acts, they look at fighting, and then when we actually dig into the school's data, that's not the case. So that is something worth taking a look at. It's also very much worth taking a look at your code of conduct for your school district. We hear many, many times from principals that certain infractions require suspension, and their hands are pretty much tied with that. If we actually go in and pull up that district code of conduct and we read what's required in more detail, what we find is that's not always the case. So for example, this is taken from one of our school districts in Florida. This is for an offense that most people would agree probably should result in suspension. What this says is that for your first offense at the elementary level of alcohol possession, it's at the principal's discretion and or out of school suspension up to 10 days and mandatory parent conference with school board or designee. So at the elementary level, is out of school suspension required for an alcohol infraction? What do you guys think? Yes or no? Laura, thank you. That's right. So suspension is not required. let alone a mandatory 3-day or a mandatory 10-day. None of those things are required at the elementary level. So that's important to know. There's another example. This is from another district where if the infraction is battery, which is physical attack or harm, it says the physical force of violence by an individual against another to distinguish from fighting. And that they clarify how to differentiate that from fighting. So for battery offenses, it says the first offense is up to 10 days OSS and a parent conference. Your second offense up to 10 days OSS, recommendation to superintendent for expulsion. So in this battery example, is suspension required for a battery infraction? Yes or no? Awesome, Laura, thank you. That is correct. Now, is a 10-day suspension required for battery? And actually, I lost track of the chat. So with this first offense of battery, the consequence is up to 10 days OSS and a parent conference. So it looks like some sort of suspension might be required. I apologize if I misspoke on that a minute ago. But what we usually hear from administrators is that if you are engaged in battery, then it's an automatic 10-day suspension. And that is not the case in this particular district. So it's always worth a second look at that code of conduct to make sure that if you can avoid giving suspension or if you can avoid giving longer suspensions, that you can do so, right? So you have to double check that. Okay, now other ways, remember one of those rationales for using suspension is to improve the learning environment. A great way of improving the learning environment is to use pre-correction. Now, a lot of times we talk about this at the individual classroom level, but you can talk about pre-correction at a school-wide level as well. And this goes back to one of those 10 critical elements of Tier 1 PBIS in terms of getting faculty commitment for what you're doing with Tier 1 PBIS. One of the greatest ways to improve consistency of both discipline and reward strategies and teaching strategies is to let staff know what your school-wide data look like. You're always de-identifying that data, so it's not like you have to worry about student privacy concerns, but basically you get that de-identified data, you make sure that your entire school-wide staff are familiar with that data. What that looks like is not so much sending out a list of students who have been suspended from school, which is something I hear from my districts all the time. But what that includes is sending out reports for your staff so that they know where those disciplinary infractions tend to occur. If there are certain times of day when those disciplinary infractions are more likely, are there certain types of disciplinary infractions that are more likely to occur? And if you can drill down into it, in specific settings, right? So helping your staff know ahead of time where are we likely to have problems so that before they enter that situation with their students, they can offer some reminders, they can design some incentives, et cetera, to help prevent those situations from ever occurring. Sharing the school-wide data is not just important in terms of how staff intervene and interact with students, but it's also important in terms of understanding where some of our vulnerable decision points might be throughout the school day. Now, your vulnerable decision points, those refer to times of day when you're more likely to act in a way that is reflective of an unconscious association or an automatic association. A cognitive shortcut may come into play here where you're acting in ways that are not as well aligned to what your goals are as you might want them to be. So that's your vulnerable decision point. You can develop or you can identify VDPs, we call them. You can identify a VDP at the school-wide level. So you're looking at your discipline data and you find out, oh, our cafeteria is the place where we're getting our most discipline. So then things that take place in the cafeteria, that triggers or that identifies that VDP for your school. You can also identify a VDP at the classroom level, and this is something that teachers can do independently. They probably could use some coaching on how to do it, but basically it's where a teacher thinks about their school day, and they start out by identifying activities or situations that are challenging for them. Sometimes our teachers do that by looking at classroom managed data. Other times they can do it just by reflecting on their day. Now, once you've identified those challenging activities, the next step is to identify those triggering behaviors for you personally. So what are the hot button behaviors that take you from being maybe moderately stressed or challenged to being, and like something must be done to change a situation immediately. So identify those hot button situations or those hot button behaviors. And then the next step is to identify how you typically feel at those particular moments. So for me, if I'm thinking about my daily life, then some things that might be particularly challenging for me would be knowing that I'm being observed by my superiors, right? So I know that that is a situation that is challenging. The things that would trigger me would be having maybe a student start to act out while I'm being observed. How would that make me feel? Extremely stressed, extremely anxious, and I would feel a lot of pressure to do things the correct way. So that would be one of my personal vulnerable decision points. The next step from there is to figure out a replacement behavior that I can use instead of falling back to using exclusionary discipline. That's your neutralizing routine. The goal with your neutralizing routine is to create some space between your trigger and your response. And so you can do a simple if-then statement in order to design that neutralizing routine. So the idea there is to make sure that you're delaying decision until you can think clearly and act in line with your values. It's supposed to help you reframe that situation so you can act in line with your values. And it's also designed to help you take care of yourself so that you don't constantly have that pressure of responding right there in the moment. You can pause, you can breathe, you can let that automatic stress response start to settle down. So an example of a neutralizing routine would be if a student disrupts class while I'm being observed and I feel myself getting angry or embarrassed, then I'm going to take 2 deep breaths and ask the student to see me after class. So that would be an example of where I can identify my own VDP and develop a neutralizing routine specific to my needs. This would also be something where we can develop a school-wide VDP, right? So school-wide, we're looking at our data. You're identifying those vulnerable situations. You're identifying how you might be feeling in those situations and deciding what you're going to do instead. And many times those social skills in terms of self-regulation, those skills come into play with these VDPs. Verbal de-escalation and understanding what that escalation cycle looks like is another really good strategy. If you're thinking about pre-correction, if you're thinking about vulnerable times, then also that helps you see when folks are starting to escalate and de-escalate. Understanding that will help you know how best to respond in those different situations. Now, many times our special education teachers have a lot of familiarity with verbal de-escalation. However, we don't always see that same type of expertise in teachers who are focused on students who are in general education. So if you need additional information on that, then we do have an online skill development module specific to verbal de-escalation. Okay, reflection is another really popular strategy. And so I'm going to pause for a second and share a video with you all. Julie, thank you for that feedback. I appreciate that. Okay, and I picked the wrong window. There we go. And so I have a short video for folks.
First, I'm going to read a quote. To succeed, you must first improve. To improve, you must first practice. Young people have to be given space to grow and to feel like, okay, I made a mistake, but from this learning experience, I can continue to become better. To learn, you must first fail.
When you're talking about student discipline, a lot of times we are punitive because it's faster and restorative takes more time. But restorative practices are better long-term. So at Pearl-Cohn, we have a place called The Zone, which we use in lieu of suspension.
Welcome to the zone.
It's a collaborative space where kids get into a circle and they discuss what their behaviors were and ways to correct it.
We have the zone every morning from 7 to 9 a.m. Today, we had 8 students in the zone. We're here today to talk about how to make things right when we make mistakes, poor choices. Usually the infractions are cell phone use, disrespect, cursing, but it could also be that there was an argument in a classroom or more aggressive behaviors that also get sent to us. So even though you had a conflict that brought you here, if we can bring our best selves to this circle, we can get a lot done, we can learn from each other. When students come in, we go over circle guidelines so that there are agreements that we hold within this space. What does it mean to listen from the heart?
You're trying to feel like you're relating to the situation.
Just like showing respect to them.
Once we teach them really what the zone is and how this is not a space where there's a power dynamic between you and another person, then they kind of disarm and we get to what's causing that behavior.
I had somebody come to me and tell me that a friend said something bad about me. Most of the time when you're in trouble, you get a referral and you have a consequence. They don't really want to hear your side of the story.
Well, what happened?
When you come into zone, they have a conversation with you and they kind of tell you how to solve your problem the positive way. I was able to go to her and work it out.
We're really just trying to get context. Whenever there's a conflict, right, both parties contribute to the conflict, right? Although you may not feel like you contributed to the problem, you played a piece in it. And that's a part of the social emotional learning that we're trying to get them to see. We really want to have a discussion about the things you can control.
I just need to catch myself and know my surroundings.
It is a place for students to process their role in it, understanding who was harmed, but then also understanding that it's okay to reflect on what you as a student needed in that situation.
I don't need anything from others to make it right because I can be mature on my own.
But how can we help you in the maturing process? Because we're going to be here too. What I usually say is I don't want to change your behavior. I want you to think about it before you do it. Really, I've seen them becoming very intentional about what they do, what they say.
Everybody has to own up to their consequences.
And that's the whole purpose of the zone.
By me owning it, it's gonna help me better.
All right. That is one of my favorite examples. For me, it demonstrates a few different ideas. One is that reflection is really key to changing behavior, helping students learn from their mistakes. Another is it's a great example of how you can use some strategies from different approaches, such as restorative discipline or restorative justice. You can use those as part of your MTSS for behavior, as part of your PBIS framework, and it can be really effective and very meaningful for everyone involved. So that was an example from Pearl-Cohn High School. I think they're in Tennessee. And for me, again, it speaks to the strength of reflection as an alternative response for disciplinary infractions. Now, there are some considerations that I'd like you to take with you as we leave today. Really, it boils down, the big idea there is that students' ability to engage in self-reflection is dependent on their age and their experience, and sometimes it just depends on their overall fluency to concentrate and reflect on their own behavior. So you can use different social skill curricula to help teach some of those skills, but it's also really important when you're asking a student to engage in reflection to provide reflection questions that are developmentally appropriate. Most restorative strategies that we see, they kind of start at this level where they're asking students some pretty advanced questions, asking them to reflect on their behavior, which they may or may not developmentally be able to do at that point. So work with your teachers, your grade level teachers, and look at how you can take those questions and kind of scale them down a bit so that students who are younger and even very young can also participate in this particular response. Other considerations, your student learning history. Many of our students do not experience the same disciplinary style as we present with restorative practices. Think about that history and how you can fill in any gaps in their familiarity with that process. Think about that existing relationship with school personnel. If students don't know you, if they don't have a relationship with you, then we can't expect them to care about you or the impact their behavior had on you. So again, prioritize relationship building activities. If you are dealing with a disciplinary situation, you personally don't have that relationship with the student, but another staff member does, see if you can work with other staff members who can make that connection or have that relationship. Make sure when you're using reflection that it is a student-directed activity. So this is how we teach responsibility. We get students to critically reflect and think about how they can do things differently, and also separate the doer from the deed, which is a lot of times easier said than done. But I know we are getting short on time, so I don't want to keep you guys over. The remaining slides are here in case you want to review them. There are lots of different restorative types of strategies that you can use. You can also use in-school suspension as an alternative to out-of-school exclusion. Again, the key there is to make it effective for your students. So we're giving them some support and some instruction, and we're making sure that if they receive an in-school suspension, that it's effective in changing their behavior. Reintegration was that final piece. So if we do have to exclude a student, then our next step is to identify how we're going to repair the relationship between the student and either their peers, their teacher, their community. And the way that we do that will have to vary according to how intense or severe that particular incident was. So there are some different examples that you can look at on that last PowerPoint slide in terms of the people that might typically be involved in very severe versus not as severe sorts of incidents, some different ideas about reintegration strategies that you could use. Again, the key here is to match the intensity of the strategy with the intensity of the incident. Also know that these are just ideas. This is not an exhaustive list. But again, the purpose with reintegration is making sure the student is welcomed back into the community. So we do have a recap slide there for you. We also have, even more importantly, our contact information. So if you'd like more information on some of the information I've shared here today, please feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, if you guys would, I think we have a poll here for you. Yep, we just have a quick survey to get your impression of the content and let us know how to improve in the future. If you could take a moment or two to respond to that, I would definitely appreciate it. And other than that, I hope that you all have a great rest of the year. I hope that your holiday break is refreshing and peaceful and happy, and best of luck to you in the next year. Thank you all for attending. Thanks, Laura.